This is the United States History 202, Presentation 20, the final presentation and lecture for the course, The Modern Era, 1974 to the Present. So essentially all we're going to do here is look at some major issues that took place between 74 and the current era, and in many ways this is all contemporary politics, as much of this course has been in the last few presentations. So we're going to give you a brief overview of maybe some presidential politics, some pop culture, some of the current events and things of that nature. So let's get started. This is it. All right, so major issues: domestic politics, presidential elections, and the term conservative v. liberal, what that actually means. We'll look at a little bit of foreign policy dealing with the Middle East. We'll talk about the late 1970s, the 80s and 90s, and early 2000s, social issues and pop culture, and then just a few minutes on what's next. So we'll start with presidential politics. The president in office from 1974 to 1977 was Gerald Ford, Jr., who was a moderate Republican. He replaced Richard Nixon as president after Nixon resigned, and he was Speaker of the House of Representatives at one point. So what's really interesting about Ford, there was a time when he didn't live in the executive mansion after Nixon resigned. So the executive mansion was actually a two-story little brick house in Northern Virginia. It's currently privately owned. That's what Ford was living in. So it's kind of an interesting little twist on the executive mansion there. It wasn't the White House for a time. Nixon, of course, resigned, and there was an attempt to, or at least people wanted to have him convicted of some type of crime, but Ford pardoned him. And this was highly unpopular for Ford to do so. In fact, his popularity took a big hit because of that. Ford had been an athletic star in college. He was considered to be a very likable guy. But interestingly enough, there were two assassination attempts on Gerald Ford, both by women, which normally doesn't happen. Usually assassins are men. But in this case, two women tried to kill Gerald Ford, and both of these women had some mental issues. In fact, one was a follower of Charles Manson. Of course, the major issue of the Ford administration is the economy. There was tremendous inflation. There was an energy crisis. Debt was extremely high. And so Ford actually had a campaign slogan when he ran again in 1976 of "Win, whip inflation now." So this is a real problem. You had this stagnant economy in the 70s that was created by Nixon coming off any kind of precious metals standard. You had extremely high federal spending, which led to high debt. And so the economic malaise of the 70s mirrors what we're essentially going through now here in this particular period of time. In 2013. Now, conservatives blamed him for a loss in Vietnam. Troops had been withdrawn in 1975 and a very soft stance with the Soviet Union. And so there was an attempt in 1976 to get somebody else nominated for the Republican Party, and that happened to be Ronald Reagan, who almost won in 1976. But Ford won the nomination, and so as a result would face Jimmy Carter of Georgia for the presidential election in 1976. Now, Carter was born in Georgia, born in Plains, Georgia. He was an outsider, governor of Georgia for a time, but was considered to be a political outsider, not a man of the Beltway, a peanut farmer, very critical of Ford's handling of the economy. And because the economy was so bad in 1976, and because Ford was seen as this kind of moderate Republican and not all conservatives rallied around him, Carter's going to win. In fact, fairly handily. He only gets 50% of the popular vote, but gets a little over 50% of the Electoral College vote. Though, Ford, if it goes, a couple of states go for Ford, Ford wins the election. So it was still fairly close, but Carter did a very good job in winning this election. In fact, he's going to use that outsider stance as a way to get into the executive office. So Jimmy Carter becomes the 39th President of the United States. He's in office from 1977 to 81. He, in fact, inherits this energy crisis that had been going on beginning in the mid-70s. There were gas lines, gas shortages. People were waiting in line for hours to get gasoline. There was talk about, and this eventually happened, changing the miles per gallon standards for American automobiles and reforming the energy sector. Carter actually was in favor of nuclear energy. He had served in the Navy, was someone who was supportive of that. But you also had the period of time where the government's going to start spending more money, and so you were supposed to see a growth in the economy, but that didn't happen. Of course, when the government spends more money, you actually see inflation. So there's supposed to be a growth in the economy, but it never happened, and we had high inflation, and so they started calling this period stagflation. And this started happening with the Ford administration, but continued in the Carter administration. So the Keynesians said that when you pump the economy like this, you're not supposed to have a stagnant economy, but that's essentially what happened. It's still happening, and generally I think this is discredited Keynesian economics. When you pump the economy, you often get high inflation, even though the government today says inflation is not a factor. It is. You're starting to see, if anybody who goes grocery shopping knows that prices have gone way up, and the economy is stagnant. There's high unemployment. So this is the exact same thing that's happening in the late 1970s. Carter was also damaged by the Iran hostage crisis, and we talked about that in the Cold War presentation a little bit. But you had these American hostages who he couldn't get, and so this was a very negative public problem for Jimmy Carter. He was considered to be a micromanager. When it's too cold, energy prices are too high, just put on a sweater, and these kind of things. So Carter received a lot of negative press for that. His most famous speech is called the Crisis of Confidence speech, and I've linked it here for you to watch. Now, Ronald Reagan was almost received the Republican nomination in 1976, didn't get it, so Republicans nominate him, in 1980, admitting a mistake. And Reagan will hammer Carter on both foreign and domestic policy, and he'll sweep to victory in the 1980 election. In fact, it's a landslide. Carter doesn't really stand a chance. Here's the 80 election, which is only 50% of the popular vote goes to Reagan, but look at that in the Electoral College, 91%. So this is a major landslide victory for Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan will be the 40th president of the United States. He's in office from 1981 to 1989. He believed in limited government spending and tax cuts, though this only happened once. He only had spending cuts in one very short period of time in the Reagan administration. The Congress had adopted something called baseline budgeting at this point, where it was guaranteed that spending would always go up when Reagan came into office. So this is essentially what we have now. Spending is never cut. Usually the only thing that's cut is the growth in spending. And that really began during the Reagan years, or a little bit before that, but you started to see this as a major problem. Tax cuts, though, did happen. His opponents called his economic policies voodoo or trickle-down economics. But the idea was to cut the highest tax rates, which had been the 70% in the Carter years, down to the 30s, and this would stimulate the economy. You did have more people out investing in the economy, and so you did have economic growth. There was some corruption there. You had some junk bond corruption scandal. You did have defense spending increases as well, which Reagan called peace through strength. And the idea here was to try to win the Cold War, which ultimately happened. But the economy would rebound in the 1980s, and Reagan was very popular. He won a landslide victory over Walter Mondale in 1984. There was a 1981 assassination attempt. Reagan actually was shot and almost killed him, but he lived through that and would then serve 2 full terms. The Iran-Contra scandal in 1987 was a major event, and it was a foreign policy scandal where there was some sanctions that were not followed by the Reagan administration, and the attempt was to try to bring Reagan out and then impeach him, though he had lower-level individuals like Oliver North who would not rat out the administration, and Oliver North became a hero because of this. And so Reagan was given the term the Teflon president because you could throw all kinds of stuff at him and nothing stuck. Reagan was very popular, and people liked his very folksy persona. He told great jokes and was just a very likable individual, so his popularity was always very high, particularly at the end of his second term. Now, here's 1984, again, a major landslide in 84. Mondale only wins Minnesota, where he was from, and Washington, D.C. That was it. Now, George W. Bush will be nominated by the Republicans in 1988, even though he faced tremendous opposition from more conservative members of the party, namely Pat Buchanan. But he ran on his attachment to the Reagan administration. He made a pledge in 1988 that, read my lips, no new taxes, which he's going to break. His opponent in 1988 was a Democrat named Michael Dukakis. He was seen as too soft. He's from Massachusetts. Seen as too soft on defense and too liberal by the American public. And there was almost no chance with the popularity of Ronald Reagan and the way the economy was and other things in 1988 that Dukakis was going to win. But it was a little closer, though. You would consider this a landslide victory. Almost 80% for George W. Bush in the Electoral College and 53% in the popular vote. So it's a major victory for Bush. So George H.W. Bush will be the 41st president of the United States. He's in office from 89 to 93. He's going to break his campaign pledge. You will see higher taxes, and the economy will go into a recession by 1992. end of 91, early 92. The thing that Bush is most well known for is the Operation Desert Storm of 1991, where the United States will overthrow or at least kick Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government out of Kuwait. And Bush was advocate of what was called the New World Order, where the United States was the only superpower, and you had this changing environment, and started seeing more world government type situations. So that is a foreign policy development in this period. But by 1992, he's seen as out of touch with the American society, and so he's going to face a serious opposition in 1992 from William Jefferson Clinton, or his real name was William Jefferson Blythe III, but he changed his name to Clinton later on. But Clinton was seen as a new Democrat. He ran a very popular campaign, focused on the economy, told people he felt their pain. Many Americans didn't trust him. He was known as a liar and an adulterer even during the campaign, but then Hillary Clinton defended him, and so people kind of overlook that, though it comes out later on in his presidency again. In fact, he was accused of rape at one point, and the charges just didn't stick. Bush also faced opposition from H. Ross Perot, who was a Texas billionaire, entered the race as an independent and then as a Reform Party candidate in 92 and 96. His folksy style attracted people, but Perot was seen as untrustworthy because he pulled out of the race and then re-entered the race, and so Perot was not an individual who Americans thought they could trust, though there was a point when Perot might have won the election. The major issues that he focused on were trade, the economy, abortion, and guns. He was kind of a conservative populist, and a lot of people gravitated toward that. So here's the 92 election. You can see that nobody gets 50% of the vote, though Clinton will win the Electoral College. There's been a lot of discussion about this, whether Perot led to Bush's defeat. When they did some exit polling data, they proved that a lot of voters who voted for Perot wouldn't have voted to begin with, and that a lot of these voters would have voted for Clinton too. So it's not certain that Bush would have won in 92 had Perot not been in the race, but probably would have been a little closer for the Republicans in this particular race. So Bill Clinton becomes the 42nd president of the United States. He's in office from 93 to 2001. What you saw in the 1990s, at first when Clinton came into office, he was very much on the left. He advocated nationalized health care. You had tax increases. But then, because this was very unpopular in the early 90s, in 1994, the Republicans swept to power in the Congress, the first time since before the Great Depression. And so the Republicans forced Clinton's hand, and you started seeing balanced budgets, tax cuts, welfare reform. But Clinton was ingenious in this way. He did something called triangulation. He made the Republican issues his own issues, and he was able to become very popular because of that. There was an economic boom in the 1990s. So Clinton wins re-election in 1996 over Bob Dole. Bob Dole was a very moderate Republican candidate, but Clinton never obtained 50% of the popular vote, and he, of course, was faced with scandals. And Clinton was impeached. The question was this justified? Well, Clinton lied under oath, so the Republican Congress impeached him. He was not convicted in the Senate, so he did not have to be forced out of office. But was that a high crime or misdemeanor? I think if you look at the founding generation, what they considered to be a high crime or misdemeanor, lying under oath was a crime. So it did cause him some popularity problems. And of course, his foreign policy, it was often seen that Clinton, anytime a scandal was coming up in his administration, he would defer interest in that scandal by bombing some country. And so this often happened during the Clinton administration. So here's the 96 election. You can see Clinton almost gets 50% of the vote and wins fairly handily in the Electoral College. Perot did run again, by the way. And again, people were saying, well, if Perot hadn't run, maybe Bob Dole wins. Probably not. The people that were voting for Perot probably wouldn't have voted for Bob Dole, or maybe some of them would, but some of them might have voted for Clinton too, and maybe a lot of them wouldn't have voted. Which brings us to 2000. Now, George W. Bush was nominated by the Republicans in 2000. George H.W. Bush's son. He ran a very limited government anti-Clinton campaign. His opponent in 2000 was Vice President Al Gore. Al Gore promised a continuation of the Clinton economy, though he distanced himself from Clinton's moral decisions and scandals. Gore, of course, is the primary proponent of what's called anthropocentric global warming, which is man-made global warming. He made a claim that he actually invented the Internet, which simply is not true. Of course, he was around when the Defense Department had the Internet established, but it wasn't Gore who invented the internet. And the 2000 election is very, very close. In fact, it comes down to a Supreme Court case. The state of Florida, the election was disputed in the state of Florida, and the Supreme Court will validate the Bush returns, not the Gore returns. And so George W. Bush will win the election, even though he lost the popular vote. You can see it's very, very close in the 2000 election. So George W. Bush is the 43rd President of the United States. He's in office from 2001 to 2009. You're going to see tax cuts during the Bush administration. There will be an economic boom in the early 2000s, but this was all a bubble. The economy was the housing bubble, for example, which actually started in the 1990s. And then there would be a recession in the early Bush administration, then, of course, this boom afterwards. But what you're going to see in the Bush administration is more government spending, higher deficits, tremendous defense spending increases, and, of course, a lot of this is brought about because of September 11, 2001, when the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon were attacked. He would defeat John Kerry for re-election in 2004. So Bush had fairly good popularity numbers in his first administration. Second administration, not so much. Dipped down to 30%. That's the same place where Obama is sitting right now. So Americans have become very finicky in their presidents and what they like. Now, the Middle East, of course, is a major issue in the American politics, particularly since 1949. Israel was established in 1949 against the objection of several Arab countries, and the United States established firm ties with Israel, weapons, economic support, which, of course, made the United States a target for Arab nations. Also, we've already talked about the Cold War and how the United States supported the Iranian coup, which led to tremendous opposition among Arab countries and some hostility towards the United States. Jimmy Carter backed the Afghan rebels in the resistance to Soviet occupation in 1979, and we talked about that with the creation of the Taliban. And then, of course, the Iranian Revolution and the Iran hostage crisis in 1980, where they start using the chant "Death to America." Reagan will support Israel in the 1982 Lebanon War. As a result, the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, will be bombed, and Reagan will withdraw American troops from Lebanon. The United States supported Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Saddam Hussein was seen as the secular dictator who could help knock out this very much theological Iranian revolution. The Persian Gulf War of 1991, Hussein was actually surprised the United States attacked him in 1991, but this was American involvement in the Middle East, and of course then our war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which started in 2002. And this really all comes down to the war on terror. What's the future? So the United States has got boots on the ground in the Middle East. They probably won't ever come out. We've had boots on the ground in Europe since World War II. We are 70 years later, and we still have troops there. I don't see the situation changing anytime soon in the Middle East with things like the hostility in Iran, Syria, Egypt. There's all kinds of problems. So this is just a continuation of the Cold War in many ways, and now under the definition or the guise of the war on terror. Now, you've heard the term, I'm sure, before, liberal and conservative. Liberals are sometimes they call themselves progressives. They tend to support the Democrats. There is something called the New Left, which has a much more social agenda, justice, social justice, and they believe in active government. They still have the Marxist economic tendencies, but they have this social agenda as well, whether it's environmentalism, feminism, civil rights. They believe that government needs to be the solution to these inequalities in society. Conservatives tend to support the Republicans. You have two types of conservatives, though, neoconservatives and paleoconservatives. Neoconservatives means new conservatives were at one time liberals who became conservative. Maybe they thought the United States went too far in certain areas, and so they tend to have a very aggressive foreign policy design. Paleoconservatives do not. And so there's also libertarians who kind of tend to support conservatives at times, but this has been a fractured party since the middle of the 20th century, but mainly since 1976 to 1981. So you have these factions in the Republican Party that often come out at election time. Now, in terms of pop culture, 1970s, you get the growth of modern entertainment, the origins of the computer age, music. You have various types of music, and I've given you links to all these different bands if you want to listen to them, but funk, disco, southern rock, heavy metal, hard rock, country, pop rock. Movies that became popular in the 70s were things like the Star Wars trilogy, eventually into the 80s, the Godfather films, Clockwork Orange, Alien, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was very popular, Jack Nicholson film, Deliverance with Burt Reynolds, Smokey and the Bandit with Burt Reynolds. So these were popular films in the 70s. By the 1980s, you had the computer as an everyday device. Video games like Pac-Man and others became popular. So you had in-home video game entertainment systems like Atari and Nintendo, which became popular, and of course, music. Things like rap, metal hair bands, pop music, which I've given you links to. All these things, they had very much an image of the 80s, and so that image of the 80s was also driven by the fashion that came out of the pop culture as well. Movies, the Star Wars sequels, Back to the Future, Friday the 13th, and other slasher films became popular. Of course, E.T. and Cold War-inspired films like Red Dawn and even Rocky IV and things like that. So the 80s definitely had a music and fashion image to it. And then, of course, by the 90s, you have the Generation X group, which was really a transition decade. Computers were becoming more of an everyday device, smaller, and so you had the internet begin in the 1980s. Entertainment in culture were more impacted by computers. You did have the loosening of moral values, so that was a trend of the 80s. Music like grunge, gangster rap, neo-hippie music, and pop boy bands and tween stars became much more popular in the 90s. And then, what next? I think we can say about history, were the Greeks correct about history when they said that history is cyclical? I think that's very true. And then, of course, fashion, music, politics, and movies are all influenced by past. I mean, particularly in the modern era, we're regurgitating things. Things that were popular in the 60s, and 70s, and 80s are coming back into style now. And so, if you study enough history, the present becomes more apparent. It's just one large puzzle. Now, one thing that people have said is different is that there's globalization of the economy. Well, really, this isn't different. This has been going on since the 1600s. And so nothing has changed there. But technology is changing things. Technology is changing the economics of the world and how people get information, entertainment, all kinds of things. So the phrase "shift happens" has often been used, to describe what will happen in the future as technology becomes more present and apparent. Okay, so that's it. That's presentation 20. And thanks for watching, and good luck on the final exam, and also on quiz 5.